It all started the day I was planting tomatoes along the edge of my backyard when a shrill voice cut through the air like a rusty chainsaw. "You're trespassing, sir." I looked up, sweat dripping down my forehead, and there she was, Madelyn Zurn, the president of our overbearing HOA, standing at the corner of her pristine white fence like she owned the whole neighborhood. Which, if you asked her, she probably thought she did. I wiped my hands on my jeans. "Come again." Madelyn marched across the lawn in her heels, on grass, and pointed a French manicured nail at the spot where I was digging. "That land is HOA-controlled common property," she snapped. "You've extended your yard beyond your lot line." "That's a violation." I stood up straight. "This is my property line, Madelyn. I've got the original deed from when I bought the house. That fence you're pointing at, been there since the '80s. Her lips curled like she'd smelled something bad. "We had the property lines reassessed last year." "You're 2 feet over." She pulled out a folded HOA letter from her purse like it was a court summons. "You'll be fined $200 for trespassing and unauthorized landscaping. And you'll need to remove that," she gestured at my tomato bed like it was a pile of rotting trash, "by Friday." I didn't say anything just yet. I just stared at her, then at the patch of earth I'd been tending since spring. This wasn't the first time the HOA had tried something sketchy, but this was the first time they were messing directly with me. "I'm not paying a fine for standing on my own land," I said calmly. Madelyn's eyes narrowed. "Then we'll escalate. You'll hear from the HOA attorney." She spun around and strutted off like she'd just won a battle. I stood there for a moment, watching her disappear behind her hedges. Then I went inside, pulled out my thick folder of house documents, and flipped to the original deed. Lot 217. Property line clearly marked, survey map attached, and that so-called common property? It didn't even exist. The HOA had changed the community map last year, without a vote. That's when something clicked. I remembered a neighbor, Max, saying his shed had been declared encroaching. Then, Olivia across the street had been told her bird bath was on HOA ground. Now me. They were redrawing lot lines quietly and fining homeowners to squeeze cash out of them. And with Madelyn leading the charge, nobody dared question it. Well, almost nobody. I made some photocopies, grabbed a measuring tape, and walked out to the backyard just as my neighbor, old Jim from next door, was watering his azaleas. "Hey, Jim," I called. "Mind helping me measure something?" Jim wiped his hands on a rag he kept in his back pocket and ambled over without a word. He was the kind of guy who didn't speak unless he had something worth saying, but he'd lived on our block for over 40 years, and his memory for property lines beat any digital survey. I handed him one end of the tape. "Start at the corner of your shed." That matches up with the original survey marker. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. He'd seen enough of what the HOA had been doing to know something wasn't right. We stretched the tape across the lawn, and when we reached the edge of my tomato patch, I planted a flag. "Right here," I said. "That's my line." Jim squinted at the numbers. "Yep, that's dead on. Same as it was back in '87 when the city replatted everything after the drainage project. That confirmed it. The HOA's new reassessment was bogus." I took a photo of the measurement, then another of the survey marker. I didn't say much else to Jim. I didn't need to. He gave me a small nod, then turned back to his yard like nothing had happened. Inside, I laid everything out on the kitchen table. Original deed, survey map, photos of the measurements, and a printed copy of the HOA's newly issued map. The differences weren't subtle once you lined them up. The new map had several lots trimmed by a foot or two along the edges, and those slivers were labeled community buffer zones. It was subtle, quiet, and completely illegal. I needed backup, so I called my cousin Trina. She worked as a paralegal in a firm that specialized in municipal law. She wasn't allowed to give legal advice, but she could point me in the right direction. As soon as I mentioned redrawing property lines without a vote, she cut me off. "That's fraud," she said. "HOAs can't change boundaries without a formal amendment to the covenants, and even then, it requires a supermajority vote and county registration." Check your county land records. If they didn't file it, it's unenforceable, and if they forged anything." She let that hang. I hung up and drove straight to the county records office. Took me 20 minutes to find the clerk and another 10 for her to pull up the plat filings for our development. There was no record of a boundary change, nothing filed within the last 5 years, no surveys, no amendments, nothing. I asked her to print the history of filings for our HOA. She obliged, and that's when things got really interesting. "Last recorded amendment was in 2009, she said. "And that was for the pool hours." I stared at the page. "So if they claimed to reassess or replat the property lines last year." She raised an eyebrow. "Then someone's forging documents." Back home, I scanned and organized every piece of evidence. I had a folder with timestamps, county-certified plats, and a copy of the HOA's letter to me. The forged map, the fine notice, and Madelyn's signature were all right there. But I wasn't going to the police just yet. First, I needed to know how deep this went. I spent the next 2 days knocking on doors, quietly, discreetly. I spoke to Olivia Max, the couple in Lot 231 who'd been told their fence was unauthorized. Each one had a story. Each one had a letter, and every single one of them had caved, paid the fines, moved fences, dug up landscaping because they didn't know what else to do when I showed them the county records. Their reactions ranged from disbelief to fury. "This is theft," Max said. "They stole our land and made us pay for it." Olivia was already drafting a complaint to the state's HOA Oversight Board, but I had a different plan. I asked them to hold off for one more day. That night, I printed copies of everything, packets for each homeowner. I wrote a short summary of what I'd found, including the lack of any legal amendment or recorded changes with the county. Then, I included a map showing which lots had been altered and how much property had been taken from each one. I dropped the packets off at 15 houses before sunrise. By noon, Madelyn called an emergency board meeting, which she announced via a mass email. It was scheduled for that evening at the clubhouse. Attendance was strongly encouraged. I showed up early. Not because I wanted a good seat, but because I knew Madelyn would try to frame the narrative before people could speak. The clubhouse was already half full when I got there. Folding chairs were set up in rows, and the board members sat behind a long table like it was a courtroom. Madelyn, of course, sat dead center. She tapped a microphone. "We've received some troubling misinformation circulating in the neighborhood. I want to clarify." I stood up before she could finish. "Point of order," I said. "I have evidence that the HOA has altered property boundaries without legal authority or county registration. I have county records, photos, and original deeds to prove it." Madelyn's face went stiff. "This meeting isn't open for it's a public HOA meeting," I said. "And under the association's own bylaws, any member may address the board with evidence of misconduct. Section 6, paragraph 3. There was a pause. Then murmurs. People were flipping through their copies of the bylaws. One of the board members, a guy named Greg who usually kept his mouth shut, cleared his throat. "He's right, Madelyn." I walked to the front and handed Greg a folder. "This is my documentation. I've also distributed similar packets to affected homeowners." None of the supposed boundary adjustments were filed with the county, which means these fines were based on fabricated documents. Someone in the back stood up. "I paid $400 last fall to move my fence. I want that money back." Another voice. "Are we getting reimbursed? Or are we suing?" Madelyn's expression didn't crack, but her eyes darted toward the board attorney who was already flipping through one of the packets. "This is a misunderstanding," she said. "There was an internal review last year. We consulted a surveyor." I pointed at the forged map. "This map has no surveyor's stamp, no date, no registration number, and the county has no record of any such review." Greg was staring at the evidence now. "Is this true?" he asked her. Madelyn didn't answer. I pulled out the most damning piece. An email someone had forwarded to me anonymously just that morning. It was from a former board member who'd resigned last winter. The email detailed how the board had discussed reallocating community buffer zones to increase HOA reserves through citation revenue. It named names. It included dates. It was the nail in the coffin. The room exploded. Greg turned to Madelyn. "Did you authorize this?" She crossed her arms. "I was acting in the community's best interest. By altering legal property lines and issuing fines." He shot back. People were standing now, shouting questions. That's when I made the call to the county fraud division. The officer on the line asked me to submit the documents through their online portal and said someone would follow up within the week. I uploaded everything before I left the clubhouse. 3 days later, 2 detectives in plainclothes knocked on Madelyn's door. They walked her out in handcuffs. Forgery of legal documents, fraudulent fines, misappropriation of HOA funds, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. The rest of the board claimed ignorance, and after reviewing the evidence, the state HOA Oversight Commission forced a full audit. Greg resigned 2 weeks later. So did 2 others. The fines were refunded. The boundaries were restored. And Madelyn? She's banned from serving on any HOA board in the state for life. Justice didn't just knock. It kicked in the door. The neighborhood didn't go back to normal after the arrest. It got louder. Not in volume, but in energy. People who'd kept their heads down were suddenly organizing block meetings, comparing notes, digging through old HOA letters and bank statements. There was a hum in the air like something had finally snapped loose. I wasn't planning on becoming the face of it, but by the end of the week, someone had printed my county plat map and tacked it to the community bulletin board like a battle flag. Strangers stopped me on the sidewalk, asking if I could look over their letters or help them pull records from the county. I told them what I knew, but I made it clear. We needed someone with real authority now. That's when I reached out to Councilwoman Renata Doyle. She'd won her seat 2 years ago after promising to rein in abusive HOAs, but until now, no one had given her anything actionable. I sent her a summary of what had happened, attached the evidence folder and a link to the HOA's bylaws and the county's mapping portal. She called me the next morning. "I read every page," she said. "The fraudulent fines are bad enough, but what you're sitting on altering property lines without consent or record is grounds for civil and criminal action." "I figured as much," I said, "but there's more happening here. I think they were using the fake fines to prop up the reserve fund." She paused. "You're saying they fabricated value on paper?" "Exactly. I pulled the last 3 financial reports they distributed. The reserve fund jumped nearly $50,000 in a year with no explanation. That's not dues. That's extortion dressed up as fiscal responsibility." She asked if I still had the reports. I did. I had everything. "I'm forwarding this to the district attorney's white-collar crimes division," she said. "They'll want statements from everyone affected." "Can you help coordinate that?" I agreed. Within 48 hours, I had 21 homeowners willing to submit affidavits. We met in Max's garage with clipboards and coffee, each person detailing exactly what they'd been told, when they were fined, and what they'd paid or removed from their property. By the time the DA's investigator arrived, the packet we handed over was thicker than a phone book. The real turning point came when someone found the missing money trail. It wasn't me, it was Trina, my cousin, the paralegal. She'd been quietly following the HOA's filed expense reports through the Secretary of State's nonprofit portal. One disbursement stuck out, a $15,000 infrastructure planning fee paid to a shell company called Aegis Community Consultants. The name meant nothing on its own. But the address, a P.O. box in the next county over, and the listed agent, Madelyn's younger brother. That was the crack the DA needed. Subpoenas went out. The HOA's bank records were pulled. And suddenly, it wasn't just about fake property lines. It was about wire fraud, racketeering, and embezzlement through falsified vendor contracts. The scope of it was massive. Over $70,000 had been funneled in small, unnoted increments to Aegis over the past 2 years, always labeled as advisory fees, planning sessions, or compliance reviews. The DA held a press conference 2 weeks later. It led the 6 o'clock news. Madelyn wasn't just charged with falsifying property records, she was indicted for conspiracy to defraud homeowners, money laundering, and operating a criminal enterprise under the guise of a nonprofit. And she wasn't alone. Greg, the board member who'd played the neutral card during the meeting, had signed off on every payment to Aegis. Turns out, he and Madelyn's brother co-owned a private investment group that had been quietly buying up foreclosed homes in nearby neighborhoods' homes that had once belonged to residents who'd failed to keep up with HOA fines. They weren't just squeezing residents, they were targeting them for failure, then scooping up their homes through friendly buyers at auction. That was the part that turned stomachs. The DA called it a manufactured default scheme. They'd weaponized the HOA's enforcement powers to push vulnerable homeowners into foreclosure, then flipped the properties to themselves at a discount. All under the radar, buried in legal noise and fake survey maps. The state attorney general got involved. Civil suits followed. The HOA's accounts were frozen, and the judge appointed a temporary receiver to manage operations while the investigation played out. The remaining board members were removed by emergency vote, and a special election was ordered. That's when things got weird in a good way. People who'd never run for anything in their lives, retirees, teachers, hospital techs, even a barista, started campaigning for the new board. No slogans, no puffed-up promises, just practical ideas, transparency, public budgeting, and strict vote requirements for any enforcement changes. I didn't run. I'd done enough damage with my tomato patch, but I helped anyway, setting up flyers, organizing Q&A nights, and making sure every homeowner had access to the real property maps. The guy who won the board presidency was a former Air Force logistics officer named Carl. He didn't smile much, but he knew how to read a balance sheet like it was a weapon system manual. He was exactly what we needed. One of his first acts was to dissolve all previously issued fines pending review. The second was to commission a third-party audit of the HOA's last 5 years. He didn't sugarcoat anything. "We're going to find things we don't like," he said at the first official meeting, "but we'll find them together." That meeting was packed. No yelling. Just questions, ideas, and a sense that maybe the place we lived in wasn't under siege anymore. As for Madelyn, she took a plea deal. No trial. She surrendered her real estate license, paid restitution, and was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. Greg got 18 months in a minimum security facility, the others involved. Fines, probation, and permanent bans from serving in any fiduciary role tied to housing or nonprofits. The neighborhood didn't throw a party. It planted a garden, literally. Right where Madelyn had accused me of trespassing, we started a shared vegetable bed. Tomatoes, peppers, squash, even a few herbs. Jim donated tools from his shed. Olivia painted signs for each plot. Every Saturday morning, someone new came out to water, weed, or pull a few ripe cucumbers. No one called it justice. No one needed to. We'd taken back more than our land. We'd reclaimed the right to live without fear of fabricated rules or hidden agendas. The HOA still existed, but now it served the people, not the other way around. And every time someone new walked by and asked about the garden, I'd just point to the tomatoes and say, "Start there." That's where everything changed. The garden had taken root in more ways than one. What started as a patch of contested soil, once labeled common property by a woman now serving time, had become a quiet symbol of unity. But even as the neighborhood moved forward, sifting through the wreckage of manipulated maps and siphoned bank accounts, there remained one piece of the puzzle that no one had fully understood yet. Why had Madelyn tried so hard to redraw those boundary lines in the first place? By now, restitution checks were already rolling in. County investigators had finished their review of the fraudulent fines, and the temporary board Carl led was restoring order one policy at a time. But the question still lingered. What was the real end game? Greed explained part of it, sure, but it didn't explain the speed, the aggression, or the obsession with certain lots, especially mine. Late one afternoon, I got a knock on the door. It wasn't a neighbor this time, it was a man in a navy suit with a badge clipped to his belt. "Mr. Harrow?" he asked. I nodded. "That's me." He introduced himself as Special Investigator Colin Reyes from the state's Real Estate and Title Fraud Division. He'd been working with the district attorney's office and had just uncovered something buried under layers of old filings and corporate paperwork. "We believe your lot was being targeted for a specific purpose," he said. "Not just for citation revenue." I stepped aside and let him in. He laid out a stack of documents on my dining table, each one marked with fluorescent tabs. The first was a purchase agreement unsigned, but pre-filled with my address and a buyer's name. "This was discovered in the files submitted by Aegis Community Consultants," he explained. "It was never finalized, but it was prepared alongside 5 others. All for properties that had been issued escalating fines within a 6-month window." I scanned the name on the buyer's line. It wasn't Madelyn. It wasn't Greg. It was a corporate trust registered in Delaware with no listed contact other than a lawyer's name. Reyes continued. "This trust was preparing to quietly acquire undervalued homes, but not for resale. They were assembling adjacent lots." I frowned. "Why?" He flipped to the next tabbed sheet of blueprint. It was a proposed development plan, a boutique hotel, right in the middle of our neighborhood. They were trying to force out homeowners through fines, redraw lines to create buffer zones, then sell the land to a developer under the table, he said. "Your tomato patch wasn't the problem. It was the fact that your lot connected 2 others that were already being prepped for acquisition. Without yours, the layout didn't work." I sat back in the chair, stunned. "So it wasn't just about squeezing us for money." "No," Reyes said. "This was commercial land speculation disguised as HOA enforcement. And they would have gotten away with it if you hadn't pushed back when you did." He left me with copies of the documents for the civil suit the state was now building against the development firm. The charges were expanding. Wire fraud was just the start. Now they were adding conspiracy to defraud property owners, racketeering, and attempted unlawful transfer of residential zoning. The neighborhood was going to have its day in court. The trial began 2 months later, and though the courtroom was packed, the atmosphere was quiet, tense. Half the community came in shifts, sitting shoulder to shoulder on the wooden benches as testimony unfolded. Madelyn, in her orange jumpsuit, sat stone-faced beside her attorney as the prosecutor laid out the scheme. Emails were read aloud detailing how the board had been instructed to identify non-compliant owners and escalate enforcement to encourage transfer. One message even described me directly. "Lot 217 remains a roadblock. Recommend increased pressure or initiate legal threat over boundary." My testimony came on the second day. I described the encounter with Madelyn, the measurements, the county plat map, and the forged map she'd used to issue my fine. The judge listened carefully, occasionally jotting notes as the prosecutor handed in the photograph of the original deed I'd provided months earlier. Reyes testified after me, presenting the hotel blueprint and financial trail that led straight from HOA accounts to the Delaware Trust. The defense tried to argue that Madelyn had been misled, that she hadn't known the full extent of what was happening. But the emails contradicted that. Her signature was on every budget approval, every payment to Aegis, and every piece of correspondence with the so-called development trust. The verdict came after 4 days, guilty on all counts. Madelyn's sentence was extended to 7 years. Greg's was doubled after he was found to have falsified vendor audits. The corporate trust was hit with a restraining order barring any future property acquisitions in the state without full transparency and public review. And the development firm. They were fined so heavily they pulled out of 3 other projects across the region, but the story didn't end in court. A few weeks later, Carl called another community meeting, this time at the Garden. Folding chairs circled the tomato beds, and someone had brought a box of pastries from the bakery downtown. Carl didn't speak from behind a table. He stood in dirt-streaked jeans like everyone else. "We've been through hell," he began, "but we're still standing, and we're not just rebuilding, we're rewriting." He held up a draft copy of the new bylaws. They were shorter, clearer, and more democratic. Any future enforcement action would require public notice and a homeowner vote. Financial audits would be posted quarterly, and no vendor could be hired without open bidding. But the biggest change: no HOA officer could serve more than one term. The crowd applauded, not loudly, but with the kind of sincerity that settles in your chest. We passed the new bylaws that day by unanimous vote. I walked home with dirt on my boots and a copy of the new charter in my hand. Later that evening, I spotted Jim on his porch, sipping something out of a chipped mug. "Got your tomatoes in yet?" he asked. "Just planted a new row," I said. "Might add peppers next," he nodded once. "Good, this place needs a little spice." The wind carried the scent of fresh soil and cut grass. Somewhere down the street, kids were laughing. The fences were still standing, but they didn't feel like barriers anymore. They felt like lines we'd chosen to respect, not ones forced on us by forged maps or empty threats. And just before I stepped inside, I looked back at the corner of the garden, the spot where this whole thing had started. The soil was dark, rich, healthy. Funny how something as simple as a tomato patch could unravel a criminal enterprise. But it wasn't about vegetables. It was about people deciding they wouldn't be pushed anymore, not by letters, not by lies, and not by someone with a clipboard pretending to hold the law in her purse. We'd taken back more than our yards. We'd taken back our voice.